Hello and welcome to episode 120 of The Dive Down, a Magic the Gathering podcast focused on the latest decks, trends, and strategies for the casual spike. My name is Stanislav here in Chicago, and with me on the line from Denver, Colorado, it's the one and only Shane. Is it Beeps?
Stan, it's been like, I don't know what, how long, like 30, 40 episodes since you've changed the intro line from Magic the Gathering podcast for the casual spike, focused on the latest decks, trends, strategies, and modern, and it still throws me for a loop. I'm like, Stan, you're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. Oh, no, it's right. That's right. That's the way we do it now.
What kind of name is Beeps?
It's a pseudonym, so just keep rolling with it, you know.
Also with us, the Godfather, Dave Harbarger.
I didn't bust in early this time. Look at that. And we don't have time for this because we messed up this episode. And we started with a casual hang episode, and then we have 5 topics to go through. So just go, Stan, go.
Well, you did that thing you do, Dave, which is just like every once in a while you get a wild hair, and then we look at the notes the next day. It's like, oh, Dave wrote 13 pages.
Oh God, Dave wrote the episode about stuff none of us want to talk about.
Last night, I was going through my bulk boxes, and then I got done with that, and I found some stuff, and then I was like, I'm just going to work on the episode, and I turned on Future Nostalgia by Dua Lipa, and then I woke up a zillion hours later with 13 pages of notes. I hope you enjoy them. She will, I think. She's an Izzet player as well, so.
Written in a language you had to have translated, papyrus on your chest.
That's right.
On this week's episode, we're going to try and do a lot. In fact, maybe we're biting off more than we can chew. First, we're going to do a breakdown, sending off the current modern metagame and consider whether the release of Strixhaven might change the format as we know it today. Then we'll dive into some Kaldheim cards. That's right, Kaldheim cards, to do a sunset show for the last set and reevaluate our initial impressions from Cold Land to figure out what cards we got right, what we got wrong, and how it ultimately impacted our favorite formats. That was a really tough paragraph to read.
You're losing them, Stan. You're losing them. Make it snappy. Make it quick.
Then we'll wind down with a brief brew session and chat about the new Strixhaven tools that we're looking forward to playing with, including a return to our roots to talk about our all-time favorite deck, Izzet Phoenix, and why putting cards in the graveyard can be good.
Dun, dun, dun. Caw-caw.
And finally, if time allows, fingers crossed, the nation of Dive Down shared a ton of amazing Q&A material for us. Hopefully we can get to those, but you know how effusive we can get when Izzet Phoenix is on the mind.
There's no chance it's happening. 0%.
We're not going to have time for questions.
Hold on, before we get in, I also want to thank my 2 co-hosts for taking the lead on this one. I was almost going to skip this episode. It's been a wild week for me. So I'm going to be able to play Peanut Gallery. You're just going to hear me just chime in with stuff now and then to troll my co-hosts and annoy them for critiquing their notes.
That's funny because I looked in here and you have a bunch of notes in here.
So yeah, I've got a bunch of notes that are all just like, I think that I actually said this.
Oh, God.
Great. That's exactly what we want.
Oh, God. This episode is going to be 3 hours. All right, let's housekeep. Shout out to a couple of new patrons to join the Dive Down Nation, Andrew W. and Dylan P.
Dylan P. back again. Took a break. You know what brought him back? Faithless Looting, friends. Faithless Looting brought Dylan back to us. Welcome back, Dylan.
We love boomerang patrons. We always welcome you back.
Time's a flat circle.
Mm-hmm.
Also, shout out to a couple of patrons who increased their tier, Simon G. and Blue Cheese. Thank you both very much.
Is Blue Cheese new? I don't think I've heard that name before.
It doesn't ring a bell.
They tweet.
Yeah.
Okay. The lurker, really?
Thank you, Blooch.
If you'd like to support the show, you can find us over on Patreon at patreon.com/thedivedown. You can also support the show while playing Magic the Gathering with a Mana Trader subscription for renting Magic Online cards. If you use coupon code THEDIVEDOWN, all one word, when you subscribe for Mana Traders, you'll get 15% off your first 3 months of a Magic Online rental subscription. And hey, if you're an Arena player, you can also support the show without spending any money by downloading the free deck tracking companion software over at untapped.thedivedown.com. We get a little kickback from that as well. All right, we got to keep it moving. Keep it moving.
Yeah, I was going to say, the first stop in this Station's Wedding style episode, where the first station we're going to stop at is the breakdown, where Stan has put together an assessment of the modern metagame.
Yeah, it's a bit of an assessment, but I've got questions for you guys. And obviously, since we have a lot to get through today, you might be surprised that I'm going to try and squeeze 2 modern events into one short breakdown.
You gotta.
I gotta try.
It's the dive down style. We put everything in this bag of holding.
That's right. Instead of going through each top 8 individually, what I'm going to try to do instead is talk about the finals from each event. Then I'm going to look at the overall deck spread and consider whether Strixhaven shows any signs of potentially disrupting the current top decks in the modern format. And we had 2 pretty high-level modern events this weekend, which is what I'm going to talk about too. On Friday, there was a modern super qualifier. No clue what that means, but it sounds fancy. And then on Saturday, there was a showcase challenge. Same thing. Sounds good. Who knows how to get in it or what it means to anybody. But, I love good branding, so we're going to acknowledge it as probably the big deal that I'm assuming that it is.
Mm-hmm.
And the tournaments actually had some pretty surprising finals, in my opinion. Because in the super qualifier, the winner was Eldrazi Tron.
Mm-hmm.
Haven't heard that name in a while. And they beat Blue Black Mill in the finals.
Tier 0, baby.
Then in the showcase challenge, the winner was Amulet Titan, a deck. And in second place was Esper Control.
Huh?
Perhaps you mean Esperka.
Huh? What is that? What is Esperka?
Esper, it's Esper Control with some saffron sprinkled on top.
I thought it was a secret international language that we were imagining in our utopian future. All of us will speak Esperka.
Esperantica.
Yeah.
All right, I want to talk about Esper Control really quickly with you guys because the shell is pretty similar to standard blue-white control, but the deck is essentially splashing black for some Esper Charms, some Fatal Pushes, and some Kaya's Guile in the main deck. And then more sideboard cards that are black, including Kalida's Trader of Get, Thoughtseize, Eliminate, and Go for the Throat.
What do you think that brings to the deck? So it brings some proactive hand disruption in your Thoughtseizes. Esper Charm, of course, is like, just one Thoughtseize?
It's just one Thoughtseize, yeah.
Okay. Scratch that note. Esper Charm, of course, is guaranteed 2-for-1, right? It's draw 2 or target player discards 2.
Yeah, at instant speed.
Yeah.
At instant speed. And I think it's a Disenchant is the third mode.
Oh, that's right. Yep. And then Fatal Push, which is a nice removal spell, I've heard.
Mm-hmm. Tease play.
It's really about Go for the Throat.
Yes.
Which is, Go for the Throat is, I love all of the 2-mana instant speed removal spells that we have to select from. So it's like monocolored creature, non-black creature, non-artifact creature, non-legendary creature.
Non-black, non-artifact creature.
Yeah, that's what isn't Go for the Throat is that strictly worse than Doomblade? Like, what am I missing here?
No one knows.
No one knows, yeah.
I would love to talk really quickly about Kaya's Guile in particular because there are some MTG Finance chat surrounding this card. A few weeks ago, it was like $2. Now it's closer to 10. It's been spiking recently. And as far as I can tell, the only real reason is that it's just popping up in this Esper Control deck in Modern that is getting increasing popularity.
So I've seen this deck floating around on Twitter, but haven't taken a deep look at it. How many does this deck run? 4 Kaya's Guiles? It runs a lot, right?
Yeah, so the one that came in second place had 3 in the main and then a 4th in the side.
Wow, that's amazing.
For those who don't remember, it's an instant 1 white black, choose 2. Each opponent sacks a creature, exile all cards from each opponent's graveyard, create a 1/1 white and black spirit creature token of flying, and then you gain 4 life. But it also has Entwine 3, where you get to choose all modes if you pay the Entwine cost. Guys, what do you think is the best mode on this card?
I'm assuming it's get rid of your graveyard. However, I'm sure that good players can come up with an opportune time to make any of the other ones good, including each opponent sacrifices a creature, and also you gain 4 life.
Man. So this Esperka deck is run, how many Esper Charms does it typically run main?
I believe this one had 3.
So there's 3 CMC instant speed modal spells that this deck thinks it can just run, and apparently gets away with it, which is delightful.
Can I blow your mind? It also has, I think, 2 or 3 Archmage's Charms.
I was going to say it also has that card too.
Amazing. The fact that this card is seeing legitimate play is a little bit surprising to me because sure, we get flexibility, and sure, you can just run this main deck and do things like buy yourself maybe 3 turns against a prowess deck. Like let's say you make a flying blocker and gain 4 life, or like they went all in on a prowess creature that they had one of, and then you made them sacrifice it. That would be a pretty bad prowess player, in my opinion, if you had 3 mana open against it, as your control opponent.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, you can hit a graveyard, like you said, Dave. You can get rid of like a Prime Time or like an Ulamog or something. I don't know. Like 3 mana is not cheap for these effects, but you choosing 2, you get that flexibility. So, and control decks, I think, in my wildly extensive control deck playing, flexibility seems like the key when you have a lot of decks to deal with in the modern metagame.
It's just a lot of decks, a lot of cards bringing a lot of different options here. If you look at, this is modal card the deck, basically. Archmage's Charm has 3 modes to choose from. Cryptic Command has 4 modes to choose from. Drown in the Lock has 2 modes to choose from. Esper Charm has 3 modes to choose from. Kaya's Guile has 4 modes to choose from. Kaya's, yeah, exactly. So this is like, if you wanted every card that came bullet, like your deck looks like a PowerPoint presentation with all the bullets that are flying around here. You know what I'm saying? So I think it's a nice thing, like you said, to be able, as a control player, to have a lot of options. If you can think ahead and prepare yourself for what's going to be good in the early game, what's going to be good in the late game, I can kind of see it. But you're right. All these cards do seem a little slow to me, but maybe it's okay where we are right now.
Do you think that instant speed graveyard hate is important right now in Modern?
I just think it's nice to be able to have main deck is probably what's good about it. And so you're not running like Nihil Spellbomb where you're kind of like ending up with something that's not good. You're not relying on bringing those in out of the side. If you have to do it more than once, this deck also has 4 Snapcaster Mages. So if you get in that kind of turn 5-6 area, you can snap it back.
The one thing I'll say about that mode in particular, looking at these 2 top 32s, I feel like the only decks where that's relevant is like if someone has a Lurrus deck, which is a part of the meta, but it isn't necessarily the top of the meta or like the biggest chunk of the meta. But also just like sometimes shrinking a Tarmogoyf seems like a really great use for this Kaya's Guile periodically.
Yeah, I think some important stuff. I mean, we're looking at a lot of cards that we haven't seen a lot of in the past. Like even Drown in the Lock is not something that we're like, is typical for a lot of these decks. And there's a couple in this deck. And what we're really seeing is I think, is less of a reliance on the early game of like massive amounts of path that's also ramping your opponent. And not as many counterspells as you might expect in a deck like this. So your bridge is all of these 3 mana 2-for-1s or potential 3 mana 2-for-1s, right? And we have things like, Esper Charm, Archmage's Charm, and Kaya's Guile that are a different kind of bridge to get you to your end game of Teferi 5, right? And just taking over the game with the card advantage that either Jace, the Mind Sculptor, Teferi 5, your late game snaps, Cryptic Command, all that kind of good stuff. So it's just, I think it's important for me, at least, to look at this deck and be like, well, how is this deck doing what control decks do, which is reach the end game? And I think they're just doing it with a more substantial mid-game beef than we've seen in other types of control decks.
And of course, as we talked about recently, Teferi is very good right now as long as Heliod is some part of the metagame because it can beat Infinite Life. Mm-hmm. And you'll even notice that in this particular event, the 3rd place deck was also a blue-white control style deck. And that's cool.
Okay, let's look at the actual decks from the weekend. I've got all the decks that appeared with at least 4 copies between Friday and Saturday. With 8 copies was Izzet Prowess, followed by Mono Green Tron and Boros Burn with 6 copies each. And then we had Heliod Convo and Niftalite with 5 copies each.
Okay.
Yeah. And then E-Tron, Control, and Death Shadow were all 4 copies apiece, although Control was 3 of those versions were blue-white, 1 was Esper, and then among the Shadow decks, 3 were Jund, and 1 was 4-color.
Okay.
So let's just say, for the sake of discussion, this is the tier 1 in Modern right now for the last month or so. Do you agree, disagree, or surprised with any of these contenders?
I guess the main one that's a surprise to me is Niftalite, which has been making a lot of waves in Pioneer lately, but hadn't heard about it too much in Modern in the recent past, the last month or so, I would say. So I guess it's interesting that people are starting to bring that powerful, we still want to get Valki / Tibalt out via Bring to Light as part of a kind of way to give that card a new dimension. But that's a lot of Niv to light, so I guess that people must like it at this point.
Yeah, the top performing Niv deck was in 5th place in the Super Qualifier, and that was actually a Yorion build as well.
Whoa, that's interesting.
You know what? They're all Yorion by the looks of it, actually.
Yeah, are they doing their kind of like Utopia Sprawl and Abundant Growth kind of vibe? Is that where we're at?
I think so.
Yep.
I don't have the deck in front of me to say with confidence.
Yep, Abundant Growth and Utopia Sprawl. We're flipping cards, ramping.
Shin, are you surprised by anything?
The thing that's interesting to me a little bit is it's sort of tempting, I think, to see something like Burn as a top tier deck, but over the past month, it actually has just been sort of average. And in the past maybe week, 2 weeks-ish, it's been on the upswing in terms of its performance in these premier level events. And so I think people are maybe realizing Burn has game, especially against Heliod, and perhaps it's fast enough to get under things like Tron, and perhaps fast enough to get under things like the various control decks, and can kind of just ignore some other strategies by going to the Dome. So that's kind of a surprise to me, but also just Titan, which always just sort of hangs around in tier 1.5, tier 2, and here isn't kind of really anywhere this weekend, except, you did say you saw it in as one of the winning decks, correct?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah, so it's always around. It's just not hugely popular right now.
Yeah, there were 2 Amulet Titan decks in the Modern Showcase, and then in the Super Qualifier, there were 2 Red-Green Titan decks, so like Titan Shift, basically. But that's it. 4 decks had Primeval Titans. I broke out these top 7 decks into 2 categories I want to present for your consideration and perhaps debate. And that was the decks to beat, and then the decks that can beat. Okay? So I have 3 decks to beat in Modern right now, which is Izzet Prowess, Green-White Heliod, and X Shadow. And then the decks that can potentially beat those 3 are Tron, Burn, Niv, Control, and E-Tron.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, the question for me, Stan, that I thought of when you said these are the decks to beat, like what makes a deck to beat exactly? And I don't mean I question your tier there. I think it's more what are the characteristics of these decks that make them the decks to beat? And it's kind of like, is it just, I think sometimes we see raw power level of a game plan that's just so good that it makes a deck to beat. But then there's also, I think, decks that have a strong fundamental game plan combined with flexibility. Like whether that's they have a good sideboard, or they have main deck cards that are flexible, or they have like the ability to play a different game plan against rougher matchups and things like that. And so what I'm getting at is I think that in different times in Modern, we have seen different decks in the tier 1. Mm-hmm. And right now, I think we're seeing a mix here where I think we don't see anything that's like a busted game 1 plan, perhaps besides Heliod. I think you could probably say Heliod is potentially a busted game 1 plan. But with Prowess and Shadow, I think those are more sort of like, those are just aggressive or disruptive aggressive strategies that we've seen plenty of times. But then in the past, we have seen decks where just like, hey, this is such an over like the flexibility and power of the decks have combined. Like let's say something like an Uro pile or an Urza style deck, right? Where it's just like, hey, these decks have so many different ways to beat you.
Yeah,
and I guess my point of this whole question is what do you both think about these top tier, and what do you think about the decks that answer the top, that potentially answer the top, that gives them those characteristics, the ability to do so? I don't think I added anything to what you asked, Stan.
Thanks.
That was an incredible case of misdirection.
A stream of conscious?
Yeah.
I guess here's what I'll do. I'll answer the first part of your question, and then I'll let Dave weigh in. I think when I think about a deck to beat, it's a combination of popularity and power. And I think that's something we're seeing with Heliod, Prowess, and Shadow in particular, in that all 3 of those are very proactive strategies that kind of demand an answer from their opponents to win, I think, with some exceptions maybe. And I think that's where Burn kind of comes in as like the deck that can answer the top because it gets potentially under some of those strategies. Whereas I feel like Prowess, Heliod, and Shadow, they're sort of setting the terms of engagement in the format currently, and people have to tweak their 75 in their main decks and play like sometimes main deck life gain in the form of Kaya's Guile to actually deal with what's happening here.
So it sounds like they're asking the best questions, right? And what I wonder though is like, what is it about, say, something like Tron or something like Burn that doesn't lend themselves to being quite as good or quite as popular as these other decks, right? Like, is it the fact that Tron doesn't have the flexibility, or it has a very linear game one game plan that can get disrupted, or just simply never come together? And then post sideboard, they have a lot of areas of weakness, a lot of cards that can hurt what they're trying to do, and they can just not win at all. And so I think that's kind of like, that's the distinction I'm trying to get at, which is like, I think that I agree with you, Stan, that these are the decks to beat. And I think my sort of foundation is flexibility and linearity, like, is kind of an interesting combination to have, right? Which is like, I have a lot of ways to win the game, and like something like Heliod, right? Doesn't even have to have a sideboard that is like anti-hate. You know what I mean? Like, it's like something like Path to Exile and Skyclave Apparition is just so good at being flexible while still being either main deckable or a super, like just a perfectly fine sideboard card to always have access to, right? Whereas it's like, if I want to beat Heliod, I don't want to run 4 Blight Beetle.
Right.
Because it's like, then I have 11 cards from my sideboard against other decks.
Yeah, they're just playing Damping Sphere, I think, to beat Heliod. So let's say you're trying to be proactive in this new metagame. I'm trying to answer the question now, which of the two categories got the most new toys?
I think as far as that question goes, Stan, I think it's pretty clear that as far as from Strixhaven goes, I really think that there's a very slim number of cards that are modern power level from Strixhaven, and a number of them center around aggressive Magecraft cards, namely Lumimancer and Light Scribe, are probably the only cards that are modern rate in my mind. There are some removal spells that I think are reasonable in that sense, especially if you look at some of the cool Silver Quill cards that came up. But I think as far as anything that's going to shift the meta, it's going to be how good is Clever Lumimancer, and does it lead to faster, different, more resilient, aggressive decks in some way or another? And we have some stuff to say about that later on. But I don't think that Strixhaven is going to make a lot of ripples here, although there are some things. So what else did you see, Stan, that might make some ripples other than Prowess Magecraft kind of builds?
Right. So I think those two Prowess cards are important to point out, even though they don't look like Izzet Prowess cards. They look like they're probably going to require some kind of shift in that deck strategy, and maybe introduce a new type of Prowess deck altogether. You mentioned the Silver Quill cards. It's Orzhov. And, they got Vanishing Verse and Baleful Mastery and Fracture, which I think are all removal spells, essentially. So that makes me wonder whether an Orzhov control deck can become more of the de facto control strategy, or if Esper just remains like your go-to strategy if you want to play control is 3 color, because you want black for, such strong, versatile removal and exile effects that can answer Heliod.
Yeah, I mean, let me hit you with this. What if things get good enough that it just becomes blue-black, where maybe all you want to run really is Baleful Mastery, and that's enough? Mm-hmm. Maybe. I don't know.
Also cool. We did get a couple of cards that I think what I'm curious to see is whether or not they can potentially elevate other decks that we're not seeing in the current Tier 1, because I don't think they slot really neatly into some of the strategies we've been talking about currently, which those are Strict Proctor and Elite Spellbinder. Really powerful in the way that they interact with opponents' plans, but these are like white creatures. They're essentially hate bears. And I don't know where they can go, but I wonder if they could potentially have the type of impact that Maul the Skyclave did or Skyclave Apparition did in elevating, former white-based Taxes decks and making some kind of like white-based mid-range deck more powerful moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think Strict Proctor is an important tool against a whole bunch of things, but namely Titan, right? Because they can't really interact with it. And so, especially without the green-white builds being popular, which it doesn't look like they are at the moment, we're back to kind of Amulet. And so I think that that'll buy you some time, but there's probably other fringe decks from there. Elite Spellbinder, I'm a little less convinced of. I think it's a playable card, but I don't know if it's going to get there to make any major shifts in Modern, at least. But we'll see. I mean, I think that it's a new tool for the toolbox.
Here's a curveball. Could Niv Mizzet be picking up some toys from all of these crazy new gold cards they're seeing?
I think just Vanishing Verse is the card that I would put on that list of things that Niv might pick up in that sense. But I could be wrong, but that's the one that comes to mind right away for me.
I wonder if some of these gold dragons might be new alternative threats that you can put into a Niv deck that Niv actually finds as well.
It's potential. I think that you Rip Apart is also feasible. I think like one of the only Boros cards that runs is like Lightning Helix right now.
Last question. Heliod is probably just here to stay, right? We're not seeing something like Grafdigger's Cage or Damping Sphere that practically anyone can run to kind of unilaterally try to hate out what Heliod is doing.
Yeah, it just kind of gets back to what I was getting at before, I think, which is just like Heliod's anti-hate is not specific. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like it's running for Nature's Claim. It's just able to run the same stuff, like either main deck apparitions or sideboard paths or even more apparitions to like be like, oh, you have a creature that's trying to stop me? Well, bye. Or you have, even if it's like an enchantment or something like that, then you can Skyclave apparition it. And it's pretty rough when it's just like the tools that it has to stop what people are doing are just flexible and less targeted than what people have to run to try to stop it.
Cool.
Yeah, totally agree. Heliod's going to be here for a while unless something major happens where it just can't keep up or someone has a lot of incentives to run anti-Heliod cards main without hurting themselves too much.
I'm just surprised at how long it's been able to sort of not really be hated out in significant ways. So it shows the power of the deck.
All right, I'm keeping an eye out on some of these new cards and maybe other surprises that aren't even really on our radar yet that someone finds that can maybe produce a new combo deck or something totally unexpected otherwise. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and when we return, we are going to keep ourselves honest and look at some Kaldheim cards now that they have been in the formats that we love for 3 months, and talk about what we got right, what we got wrong, and what we got right in the middle. Stay with us.
Welcome back to Dive Down number 1 of a double Dive Down episode, probably. So, like Sam mentioned before the break, we are going to take a look at cards from Kaldheim that we talked about in our spoiler episodes, look at the assessments that we gave, and kind of talk a little bit about what we might learn from what we got right and what we got wrong. So, I'm going to go through a list of cards here. I kind of put them in the order of impact these cards had on the format, or kind of the amount that we missed on them in my mind anyway. So with that in mind, the first card I wanted to talk about was Tibalt's Trickery.
Is that a card?
And while I think that it's still a card, and I think that we also talked a lot about the potential for this to do combo-y things, this is one of the fastest cards to ever be banned in Modern. And I think that when we were having a discussion about this card, we focused a little bit too much on what are the fair applications for this card that was never supposed to be played fair. And, I talked about what if it was like a fun, interesting thing to do in Prowess to double up on spell triggers? What if it was, a weird part of like a bad combo that didn't really go into some of the wild cascade things that we were trying to do? I think that we knew that these problems were here, but we just didn't acknowledge how powerful they could be and didn't spend enough time thinking about that.
Dave, I'm actually more of the opinion. I think we saw the fact that it was a combo piece, especially when Everett was on. He was just like, yeah, there's no way that this card is designed to be not a combo piece. But I think we just missed the right combo.
Right.
Because I think we were like, yeah, milling on the top of your deck means it's going to really be hard to stack the deck. And I think we just didn't realize that not having to stack it was like something that we just didn't see that potential, in my opinion, where we were like, I don't think we saw the legitimate combo potential there because we just weren't looking hard enough.
Yeah. I mean, we knew that there were going to be decks that like had a bunch of lands and Emrakul, but we didn't quite see how much it was going to be to do this kind of like mid-rangey plan with the card
Yeah,
was
just
going to
the
be good
cascade
enough.
stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, this does still see play in Historic Best of One, where it absolutely sucks to play against.
Yeah, I always love when my opponent just like mulls down to like 3, and then I'm like, oh dear.
Yeah.
Here it comes.
I wonder if this is similar to what I was saying with Niv earlier, if this is a deck that could potentially improve over time as payoffs get better, where maybe you don't have to like put ultimatums in your deck. Maybe you can put like, a 40/40 Simic creature that is the size of your library or other things, future cards altogether. Though at the same time, I also feel like it's interesting in Historic that it's kind of safe because it's about that format's about to get all this new 1-mana interaction, including hand disruption and counter magic that can help keep this in check, whether you're on the play or the draw.
Yeah, potentially. But I think if we were going to take one lesson away from this, it would be that when we see something that's a combo enabler, even though we're not combo players, we should try to keep some of the discussion or have a deeper discussion about those aspects of the card instead of just going, yeah, it's going to do this, but let's talk about other things that we think are interesting with it. I think we should try to challenge ourselves to like try to nail it down a little bit more on stuff like this so that we at least kind of have the discussion in the right space.
Yeah, I tried to write lessons learned for each of these cards, and for Tibalt's Trickery is don't underestimate cheap combo enablers that let you play other spells for free.
Yeah, perfect. All right, next card on the list was Valki/Tibalt itself. And I think that we underrated this card because it turned out it was so good that it led to a rule change across all of Magic because of how much it was breaking Modern. Honestly, the card is still doing work in Pioneer via Bring to Light. We just talked about it being in Niv and Modern again via Bring to Light. It's good enough to pop up occasionally as a fair card in Historic. Cheating it in on turn 2 broke the game, even with what looked like kind of middling abilities at first. It turns out that just the pure card advantage of it was really, really good. And I don't think that we could say that we addressed the card correctly, although we definitely acknowledge that it could see play as a fair card as well.
Yeah. I mean, I just think we just missed how easy it was to get out again. Like, I think it was just like one of those things where like, yeah, this is a really expensive card and does really cool things, and it's probably pretty cool. And even Valki, the Valki side Valki side was pretty interesting, we thought. But
it's
I think
only kind of like, fine though, right?
It's very average, if that. I think the best thing Valki did in the early builds was give you a target for the Cascade spell that required a target. When you had 2 in your hand.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So, I think it's just we didn't appreciate how easy it would be to incorporate into decks, I think.
And it's just so constantly easy to overlook how impactful card advantage is. Because what the Planeswalker side ultimately did is say, you're drawing 3 cards every turn. And that's really what runs away with the games. Like, sure, you have a removal spell tacked onto it, but it's just how many cards you're able to accrue so quickly and so early in the game that is what made that card so popular or powerful. And I think that's kind of the lesson to stick with, which is a repeatable engine to draw extra cards as early as turn 2 can be good.
Recognize. Yeah. All right, next card. Vorinclex, Monstrous Raider, right? Is the full title of our friend. This is a card that I think we actually overrated ultimately when I look at it. So I kind of thought the card was nothing the first time that I saw it. I was like, this is just EDH fodder. Then I thought it was totally broken after a week or so in the format. And now it seems to have just disappeared from our formats for the most part. And what happened? I was really hot on it after playing with it a few times, but then those decks I just haven't gone back to. I haven't seen them in Historic. It hasn't popped up in Modern or anything like that really at all. Is 6 mana just too much, even for a card that is this powerful? I mean, it's a big threat.
Yeah.
Is it the mana, or is it just the place that the metagame is right now that this card just doesn't have a home that is competitive?
Yeah, I think that's really what I think, Dave, is like, this is a card that needs a shell. And that's why it still does work in like mono green walkers in Pioneer, which is still a legitimate deck. It's kind of like tier 2, tier 3 now, while some other decks have crept up as the format's seeing more play. But yeah, it's like this is not just a card you can play by its lonesome. It really wants to be surrounded by, I think, planeswalkers especially.
So that gets to what makes this card good, I think, because mono green walkers, in theory, like, wouldn't it just run this if it was 6 mana, 6/6 trample haste as well? And it didn't have all that counters text?
No, because you'd
No.
run Gargaroth over it for sure.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? For like a big green dumb card.
Yeah, there's better threats, I think.
Yeah, to me, this still kind of just reads like a good standard card. And the reason it was really a big splash in that format early on was because of the interaction between opponents' sagas and this card, where it basically just negated whatever sagas opponents were playing, which were frequently some of the best interactive spells that you could run. And I think it's in that type of environment where this card really shines, where it's not just making your planeswalker stronger, but it's really making your opponent's cards worse. And I think that's one of the reasons why we haven't really seen it like do more work in other formats, or really the formats that we play most often, is because it's not punishing the type of stuff that opponents are really doing as profoundly. And there's other big threats, like you said, at 6 mana.
Yeah. But I think the lesson from this one is right card, wrong time, sort of. Like, it's a card that's good enough to... I still feel like it's a card that's good enough to be in a deck, especially in Historic or Pioneer. There's just... that deck is not good right now. And it's...
For
and
sure.
the counterplay with it, like you said, too, is not good. Like, if there was a lot of Planeswalker control decks out there, this card is also good against that. You don't just need your opponent to be playing sagas, anything that gets counters on it. So, but we'll see. Doesn't make enough value on its own, I guess is the way I would think about it.
Yeah, entirely. That's entirely true.
Yeah. Doomskar, next card.
Overrated?
I feel like we overrated it a little bit, as it turned out.
A little bit.
Because I think that what it is that white just does not need that many wraths. And we've reached kind of like saturation in all the formats that we care about much earlier. Not earlier, but just like, how good can a wrath be? You know, like, for the most part, you still see Wrath of God as people's A-line in Historic. This isn't good enough to get there in Modern, and Wrath's not even that good in Modern. And in Pioneer, you have Supreme Verdict, which is just better because it can't be countered, and it has more utility in that sense. So I feel like what happens is you're going to have people who want Wrath of God, and then sometimes they want Settle the Wreckage because the instant speed aspect of Settle is sometimes, and Exile is sometimes helpful. And then other than that, you're kind of like, I don't really need these other cards. Now, doesn't mean I never see it. I think it's fine. Like, you see it, it feels like it's maybe a 2-ish of sometimes in blue-white in Historic. You'll see them foretell a card, and then you wonder what it is. But...
and you don't know.
Yeah.
Until it's too late.
Yeah, I mean, the foretell nature is going to be interesting because I don't really think that we're going to see like a lot of future foretell cards. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think it's something that could be brought back.
Like 5 years from now, right?
Yeah, right. So it's like foretell, you don't have that sort of concentration of foretell cards where it's like, well, what's my opponent going to do? I don't really even know. And like, sometimes it doesn't even matter. Or it's like, oh, well, they foretold the scry 2 draw 2 or whatever, right? And it's like, well, I don't really care. Like they're going to wrath me another way. Like, sometimes if they can sort of just put a wrath on layaway for when they need it is super scary, where it's like, okay, well, turn 2 I had a Burning Tree Emissary and a Bomat Courier, and they were like, well, I don't really care, I'm just going to put this wrath on layaway on turn 2, and then like as soon as you overcommit to the board, you're gone.
And it's like, then I'm going to Wrath of God you on 4, and then I'm also going to Wrath you and play a Narset on turn 6 or something like that.
Yeah, so like, I mean, there are some tempo advantages, but I agree with you, Dave, which is just like, I mean, I don't really think we were incredibly high on it. I think the broader Magic community was really high, but I think there was also just high on the fact that they were comparing it to other Wraths. And like you said, the power level of Wrath is dependent on the meta, and I think that it's strong in Historic, but not very strong in Modern right now, specifically, right? Like, I don't think there's a lot of Wrath of God or Supreme Verdicts running around, so...
Although recently there has been, the tournaments that we just went over had some of the first decks, I feel like, that have had Supreme Verdict main in a while, but it was interesting to see that.
Lesson learned, not all mana discounts equal card upgrades.
I mean, I think that's an interesting way to think about this, Stan, which is just kind of like, is it really that great to spend turn 2 and turn 3 to set yourselves up for a wrath? Like,
Right.
How many decks do you have to do that against where you're not better off just foretelling Behold the Multiverse instead and setting yourself up for cheap card draw and double spell later on?
Yeah. Anytime my opponent foretells a card on turn 2, I'm living in constant fear of Doomskar. And then I'm just like, well, guess I can't cast any creatures now. And then
But should you be? That's the question, is like how much, right? I mean, I guess you play elves a lot. And so, yeah, it's problematic there, but.
Next card.
Yep.
In Search of Greatness.
Yeah.
We called this card as like the one we're most excited to play with. If you recall.
Hold on, who? Which
I
of you?
did.
Dave and I, yeah. It was like our last spoiler app, and we were just doing a little closing.
Trust. I went back to look at what I said about this card.
Yeah,
So
I can tell.
Well, Shane has a grin on his face like he's like, you idiots. I was so right at the time. And he was. I mean, here's the thing. Card doesn't do anything the turn it comes into play. I have to constantly remind myself for these things that have splashy things that you have to, it hits a really high bar in order to make that a good card. And so, it's a whisker difference between this and like, you think about Aether Vial, which is also a card that doesn't do anything when it comes into play, but it's 1 mana. It helps you cheat on mana. This is 2 mana. It's much more unreliable in cheating you on mana. And so it just turns out it wasn't good. It's not good.
It's bad, Jerry.
yeah, I mean, besides not doing anything when it comes into play, it's just sort of like it's inconsistent in the decks where you can play it. And I mean, like my take was like it just reads like a eye-poppingly good card, and then you're like, okay, well maybe it's just okay, and then like maybe it's actually bad. And I think it's kind of ended up being kind of bad, which is sad. Like this is the first card I tested. Like I crafted 4 of these day one.
Ooh.
And was playing like historic mono green walkers and stuff like that. And it just like, it never did what I wanted it to do. And it was like, well, it's kind of what I expected, but it sucks.
I will say what I always say about bad cards that I want to defend, but it scries you a card.
Thanks.
All right,
Scryed
lesson
it.
learned. Dave and Stan should stay in their lane instead of getting pumped about green cards.
Non-elf green cards. All right, next card on the list that we had to talk about is Reidane Valkyria, which is a card that I'm not even sure that we really talked about Reidane that much or at all. But I do think that we underrated it a little bit because I think it turned out to be just better than everybody thought it would be, especially in Historic, because it had a line of text that turned out to be not important and a whole lot of other lines of text that were.
We did talk about this on the spoiler app, and I hate having to say this, but Shane got it right.
What did he say?
Well, what I said something about this card?
Yeah, you were like, this card's not bad, and it's not because of the snow text, it's because of everything else. And that's
that sounds like
basically
me.
exactly how it panned out, where
This card's not bad, and it flies, and it has vigilance.
I will say this card has been resolved about me, I think, 1 time in 3 months.
I've seen it in the constantly evolving Bant or Selesnya Angels deck, in Historic at least.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is just an available piece of like
Flying tax.
of tax tech that is helpful, and the one side helps tax the spells and the other side helps tax the damage. Turns out to be useful in both cases, and I just think it's a reasonable card that we just kind of took a pass on.
You know what was weird about this card is that it was sold to us or overhyped by Wizards marketing when this card was spoiled, and they're basically like, your opponents are going to think twice about playing Snowlands because of this card, when it's in fact the worst part of the card. Everything else just is so much more relevant than the way it occasionally interacts with snow mana.
Yeah, I've been playing a decent amount of the very average mono red snow Historic deck, and I've never once even thought about, oh man, I hope they don't play Reidane against me, because it's never happened.
I mean, I certainly wouldn't want it to be played against me against my pet deck, which I'm going to talk about next. But
oh please,
But, hey, lesson learned with Reidane: don't let Wizards marketing department tell you how to cast your spells.
Yeah, I mean, to put a finer point on that, I like your pithy headline there, Stan. But I think the thing is, you have to not be distracted by things that look like parasitic mechanics that are on a card that turn out to just be like trinket text, right? Like you said, the snow mana thing turns out to be pretty throwaway, but there was a lot of other text on this card that we could have just paid attention to, and we didn't.
it's like an insurance policy, right? Where it's like this can always be around if snow's too good,
Right.
but there's also some other stuff.
Right. That also makes it an actual card. This is a card, okay? This is a card, guys. It's my favorite moment of last week's episode when Shane was talking about the book, the library monster card or whatever. And he's like, this is a card, okay? So good. All right, next card. Ascendant Spirit. So when I was making like a list of the cards that I rated here, I think this is the only card that I put on this list that I think I rated correctly. Everything else I was like either overshot or undershot. But this card sees no play in Modern, but I've been playing it a lot in Mono Blue Spirits in Historic, and I still think it's a very good one mana value threat. I think it helps that whole deck be more comfortable with moving away from having that pirate sub theme that Siren Storm Tamer brought to the old Mono Blue Tempo decks. And it's better in that shell than in the original Tempo shells I was trying. You know, once you move into like having Rattle Chains being good and having Supreme Phantom and all those kind of things, I think that deck is like a reasonable deck, and this card is actually important in it.
Totally agree. I do surprisingly well with Mono Blue in Historic, and I love casting this card in that deck specifically.
Yeah.
I kind of think it might even be Pioneer playable if that was still a format.
We'll have to see, right? I mean, Spirits is quite good in Pioneer, so the question would be if you would or could find a way to have this card fit in there. But it's a fun deck, fun card.
You just keep playing Mono Blue Devotion. It's a fun deck. It's probably not good.
Hey, I have like a 70% win rate with Mono Blue Spirits.
I meant in Mono Blue Devotion in Pioneer.
Pioneer, yeah.
Lesson learned: blue cards can be good.
Mickey is telling us in the chat right now that Spirits isn't good anymore in Pioneer. I'm sorry to hear that. I mostly meant it has a lot of options of cards that might be better than this one, but yes.
You know what the actual lesson is? That 1 mana threats that have instant speed mana sinks that make that threat stronger and get you up on cards can be good.
Can be good, and especially when you can cast it with Flash, which is also helpful.
Well, you can't flash this one in.
Off Rattle Chains, my friend.
Oh, yeah. That's a Historic card, I guess.
Yep, it's in Jumpstart.
God, okay. I'll take your word for it.
All right, next, Birgi. Birgi. I thought we were going to have some fun. We'll see. Maybe we'll still have fun with this card.
Cost 3 days.
Cost 3. Maybe there'll be something going on with Grinning Ignis coming to you live.
Oh, yeah. That's a
with
thing.
Strixhaven. I don't know. 3 mana is too much for this kind of thing, I think, ultimately, because you just got to be doing other stuff on turn 3. You need these cards that give you the mana back, I think, to cost 2.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, like, my general thought was, like, it's just going to be too expensive for, like, your reds, even red halfway fair strategies where it's like, I just want to untap and go off, where it's just like, yeah, it's slow. But I do agree, Dave, that I think that Birgi's real home are fully broken strategies, fully unfair things. And I think we're going to see more of those, perhaps. I think there's a lot of enablers in Strixhaven that we haven't even really begun to see how they play out.
Okay. More beyond Grinning Ignis?
I think that's a big one. But I mean, we see so many ways of like, you get this spell back and like you have this cost reduction, or you can be able to cast this for free, or it's like, you know, it's just, there's a lot of interesting things in the red sphere that I think will be a thing. Whether or not it's a good thing, we'll see.
Combo cards can be hard to evaluate, though. I mean, cost reduction or mana rebates are always flashy, and so you got to be careful with them is the lesson, I would say, on this card.
Yeah, I mean, as Brian Gottlieb always says, if it's free, it's me. But unfortunately, Birgi herself is not free enough.
I hate that expression. It rhymes, but it makes no sense.
Well, no, it means I like it if it's free.
Why wouldn't you just say if it's free, it's for me, and then it would make a whole lot more sense?
Well, man,
it sounds to me like Brian doesn't know his value.
All right, I'm calling Brian right now. You guys know we go way back. I'll be back in a minute.
Okay.
Actually, he has no idea who I am. He's never heard of me.
All right, here's some cards I'm excited to talk about.
Are you really?
Yeah, I cast this card.
I mean, excited to cast it though. This is my contention. This is my question for you, Stan.
I feel like
you to cast.
I feel like you haven't played against elves enough if you don't think that they're okay with casting this card, and that card is Jaspera Sentinel.
Oh, I've been pronouncing it very differently.
How have you been pronouncing it?
Jaspera?
I've been calling it Jaspera.
Is it Sentinel?
Sentinel.
That's the Midwestern way of pronouncing it.
Albany expression.
Yeah, Jaspera Sentinel. It's the weird mana dork. You know, here's what I'll say about this. about this card. I was kind of into it, and then I pitched it to Spike, and I was like, it does this Birchwood lore, Birchman, that legacy vintage elves card.
Are you talking about Wirewood Symbiote?
No.
Well, this is really going places.
Yeah,
Stan.
what are you talking about? I'm just thinking about the drum from Affinity. What was that card called?
Oh, Springleaf Drum.
Springleaf Drum, yeah.
Well, Stan, does this, I have to ask, does this see any legitimate play besides the historic Elves deck?
No, not really. And the card I was looking for was Birchlore Rangers. And I feel like it's just doing an impression of Birchlore Rangers. And the reason it works in historic and works fairly well for now is because that is a deck that wants a critical mass of 1-drops to cast on turn 2 after you have an Elvish Warmaster out. Now, as soon as Elvish Mystic enters the format, if that ever happens, I think this card's coming out.
Yeah, poof.
But it's just the best redundant piece to Llanowar Elves, basically, right? It's kind of what it is. Like we needed 8 elves.
We're not necessarily playing 4 of these. Like I went from 4 to none, and then I settled on 2. And it's really just because I just want the occasional extra 1-drop. Since what this doesn't do is it doesn't let you play 3-drops on turn 2, which is actually what Elves wants more than anything. But it does let you spend 3 mana on turn 2, which is sometimes good with a Warmaster.
Got it. That makes a ton of sense to me.
So all I'll say is I think I rated it kind of appropriately, and it was Spike who poo-pooed it on our show.
Yeah, Spike, you remember that Spike doesn't really care about historic.
True.
So like his perspective is modern, and I don't think it made Elves a better modern deck.
No, but I do think it helps. I've seen a lot of more consistent openings from Elves because of this card being on the receiving end of Elves. It's just been helpful to have it there, I think. And speaking of Elves, we got more Elves. Because there were some other cards here. So Elvish Warmaster was a card that I tried to sell to Stan, that I think Stan was like, no? Why don't you talk about it, though?
Yeah, speaking of cards that actually did make an impact on modern Elves, it was Warmaster and Realmwalker.
Yeah, man, Warmaster is surprisingly annoying to face down. Like, it's like the problem with Elves, when I see it on historic at least, is like there's so many threats where I'm like, well, I gotta remove that one. Well, I gotta remove that one. I gotta remove that one, because it's like either providing too much ramp or too much power to the board or too much token creation, and it's just like the Warmaster just adds to that pile.
Hallmark of a good deck. A lot of must remove spells.
Stan, I got a present for you here for paper.
Is that foil?
It's a foily Warmaster.
I don't want your foil
it's just
cards,
like you, Dave.
Bro.
You can just have them. You don't have to. I'm not trying to trade it. You can just
sure, I'll take it
put
for
it in a
free.
frame.
I'll take it for free. I'll put it in my commander deck. I will say, I think we underestimated Warmaster a little bit. I think we actually rated Realmwalker mostly correctly. And a lot of people anticipated that Realmwalker would just end up being an Elves card. And that's exactly what basically happened. Though I think at first, at least I didn't fully appreciate how impactful Warmaster could be and just how many tokens it can generate.
It's a lot.
That's really what's
super annoying.
So good about it. And that you can occasionally do that at instant speed if you have an Imperious Perfect or a Coco or Elvish Clan Caller and 6 mana.
It's the worst. It's the literal worst. All the different ways that it can happen on your turn and their turn that they can get tokens.
And then why not also provide pump when you have the ability to make a quadrillion mana with all your elves and the elf mana production cards. It's like, well, I'm pumping my whole team. Cool.
And giving them Death Touch.
Oh no.
Lesson learned. Turns out flooding the board with a ton of tokens can be good. Also, Future Sight on a stick can be good. And also, 1 mana dorks can occasionally see play in the absence of Elvish Mystic.
This has been Elves 201. Thank you for attending.
Let me talk about the next card. Let me talk about it, okay?
Have you cast this card?
Behold them. I don't need to cast it because I was so right about it, even though I don't cast these cards. Okay, Behold the Multiverse. That is the Foretell Scry 2, Draw 2. Costs 4, cast naturally, but you can lay away for 2 and untap and then cast it for 1 on the blue, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good card.
It's 2 cards.
Oh, 2.
Yeah.
Which 2 stand?
It's either one of the 2 that you've scried to the top or some unexpected cards because you scried something else to the bottom.
Yeah, this is just a good card because it's just like Dave, I think, hinted at earlier, is that sometimes layaway can be good, which is just like, this does do exactly what I think at least I was kind of getting at, which is the idea that on turn 4 lets you double spell. And that's super important, is that the tempo advantage you gain from foretelling this is very advantageous.
Yeah, it's kind of like it enables a build your own cryptic command in formats that don't have cryptic commands. If you're able to do like Censor or something else with 2 mana, and then you have an additional 2 mana for this, wow.
Yeah, I mean, the wildest thing to me is that this has popped up occasionally in Modern as a one of, which I think is like fine in some cases as well, just to be able to have something to put on layaway on turn 2 when you have it against the right decks where you can take that turn off. Now, it's real hard to take off a turn in Modern, as we all know. But if you're backing it up with Force of Negation or you don't have anything else to do with your mana on turn 2, then I think it's okay. But I was surprised to see it even show up there occasionally in lists as part of your like fun of card advantage package, the flavor to taste area of control decks.
I mean, it's always surprising to see Glimmer of Genius get cast, but every once in a while you're like, wow, I guess just going for it.
I guess it's fine. Yeah, and you're right, and this is better. That's the main thing. Okay. Next card.
All I'll say about this card, every time I'm like nervous that my opponent foretells something on turn 2 and I think it's a Doomskar, it's just always this.
Right, instead.
Yeah.
That's because I think they only run like 1 or 2 Doomskars. Like they're not running a ton of them. They're not running like the full playset where you're like every time it's going to be that. But it does help. It does help with the bluffing potential. And we did identify that like network of 2 mana foretell cards between this and Saw It Coming and Doomskar. I think that I see the Saw It Coming versus Behold a Multiverse package a little bit more often in Historic than like Doomskar being in there as well. But still seems okay. So I think I underrated this card a little bit. Shane, a little bit.
Yeah, that's fine.
All right, let's next card. I'm just going to say we had a long discussion where I was like, there's got to be a good boast card. I think it's Dragon Berserker. That card's not good. Let's just go on.
Fine.
Yeah. And then
even Dave can be wrong.
I'm wrong a lot, by the way. Apparently the lesson learned from this, if you believe the last 20 minutes of this podcast, is Shane is right about spoilers quite often, which I'm not like fully emotionally ready to say out loud.
I know.
But here we are.
Think good, play bad.
Yeah, that's right. Last card I have on the list, and I'm open to other submissions after this, though. The last one is Faceless Haven, which is a card that we just didn't talk about enough, I think.
Oh, yeah, we missed it.
And I think we talked about it at all.
I don't think we talked about it at all either. We talked about it shortly after the spoiler episodes. But in Historic and monocolor aggressive decks, this is a good card. This card has the ability to give you insurance against control decks. It lets you hit hard if you need to suddenly out of nowhere. I think it's just a really, really good card on rate, especially in a format that does not have access to Mutavault, which Pioneer and Modern both do. So this card doesn't rate there. But for Historic, this is good.
And it has like weird Mutavault-like characteristics. Every once in a while, you're like, "Oh yeah, this is a knight, and it's a rogue."
Oh yeah, it's a spirit.
It's just like that matters every once in a while.
Sure,
it's all creature types, just because.
So I love this card. I like having it. You can't run a lot of them. Like the decks that I've been playing it. I crafted 4. I tried to jam 4 into the mono blue deck. You can only fit like 2, but they're nice to have around when you have them.
I feel like this might low-key be the best card for Eternal formats in this set.
Unfortunately,
it depends on what you find as Eternal.
Yeah, I think it's one of the best for Historic, I think.
Sure.
But I don't think this is going to really ever see play in Modern or Pioneer unless we're going to do some like wild, lots of land attackers, colorless deck somehow,
Agreed, but I'll add that most of the cards we're talking about didn't really see Modern play. This is kind of like a historical dive down, if you ask me.
I mean, this is where we are, though, unfortunately, with it. Not unfortunately, probably fortunately, with right now where they are in the kind of set power level assignment. Mm-hmm. Like we're on a downswing from things like Eldraine and Theros and Ikoria, and now we're here where they're kind of like, oh, we did too much, and now Modern is staying resilient and staying like what it is. And so we do have less cards to talk about from Kaldheim in a Modern context than we would have a year ago for the sets that came out a year ago, for sure.
I mean, I guess I am happy though that we do have a popular easy to play format in Historic that does see ongoing shakeups with cards like this, right? And also, like, it gives us an opportunity to be like, yeah, we can miss about cards like this, even if it's not like, it's hard to say during a spoiler episode. Like, you kind of want to have a take now and then, right? Which is like, if we were only talking about Modern and we had these cards to talk about, we'd be like, maybe Birgi does something in some kind of new Storm-like deck, and it's like, well, it's easy to be wrong, right? I think what's cool about this is Faceless Haven gives us an opportunity to say, yeah, this card can be in those aggressive monocolored decks that we see in Historic, or make all new kind of snow archetypes exist, and we still can miss it because, like, it's a newer format for us, and we're thinking about a different type of power level than we've had to think about in the past. And yeah, I think it's cool that a card like this can be pretty darn solid in a few decks in Historic, but probably just never sniff other formats probably. So it's fine.
Yeah.
Lands that can be threats. Who knew?
Especially in a format that has a paucity of those, right? There's always good land creature cards.
And it's efficient.
They all have them. Like, Modern has a ton of them. Pioneer has a much smaller selection that I think might only be Mutavault when I really, really think about it. I'm trying to remember if there's anything else. And then, I guess you have all the weird ones that are like
Crawling Barons. I guess.
All that kind of stuff that comes up as well. And then you have this one, which is kind of like Historic's, like you said, best one, probably. Anybody else have any cards that they would put on the list? This was kind of what I gleaned.
I didn't have time to get in the notes, but Goldspan Dragon. I think Goldspan Dragon was an interesting one we talked about. I mean, I did go back to and checked ourselves, and we weren't overly high on it. And I think we did our due diligence in saying, hey, here's the potential for this type of card.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing is we identified a card that was really powerful for Standard. Is how it turned out. Like, that card is really good in Standard as at different points in time. Now, I don't know if it's good in Standard this week, but I think that it was at that level, and it's maybe just not enough to be good in our formats right now.
I will say this. I'm impressed how quickly we got through this section, because we've got plenty of time to talk about Izzet Phoenix and maybe, just maybe, a couple other decks, and maybe, just maybe, after that, even a question or two.
Yeah. I was driving. We're going.
You're like George Costanza. You always make great time.
Am I the Costanza? Am I the Costanza of this podcast? Is that true?
Definitely.
I'm Larry David. Okay.
One way to look at it. All right, we don't need to take a break. Let's do a.
Why don't we take a break?
You want to take a break? All right, I'll go get a glass of water then.
So for this special episode where we're doing a bit of a grab bag, we are going to do a second dive down essentially right now, or main segment, I guess you would call it, of stuff we're excited to play with this week now that Strixhaven is out. And, I think there's a lot of different things that we could pick from to talk about, but there is one thing that is kind of looming large over the formats that we care about based off of Strixhaven, and that is, of course, Izzet Phoenix going to be a real deck in Historic or not?
Inquiring minds named Dave and Stan want to know.
I think it depends on your definition of a real deck, because I can guarantee you it's going to see a lot of play, win, lose, or draw, especially on Thursday when the new set goes live.
Immediately, people are going to be all over it.
Like, this is the first thing I'm spending my wilds on, and that's just because I know from hearing the internet, I have a little thing in my ear that tells me what people are tweeting about at all times. It's all anyone's talking about. Are the birds back in town?
It seems to be, huge as far as discussion goes. And you knew we would come back to it because, of course, our first episode is an episode about playing Izzet Phoenix and also Self-Mill.
Look, Colin, you both ever think about how that episode's like an hour, 20 minutes long?
Yeah, I think about it all the time.
It is? I don't even remember that.
Yeah, it's really short. I don't know how we pulled that off.
I don't know. Someday we'll get back to hour-long episodes. Maybe. Someday. We'll see. But I doubt it. Okay. The most interesting thing to me about Izzet Phoenix right now is not so much the fact that people are kind of treating it as if it's a foregone conclusion that it's going to be back. I don't think people are treating it as a foregone conclusion that it's going to be good. But I do think that there's a lot of debate around a couple of really interesting things in the deck itself that I kind of wanted to talk with Stan about, because we haven't had a chance to talk about it, get Shane's impressions about several different like decision points that are presented in the deck right now. And so here we are. Well, I've been talking with people in the Slack about it. I've been reading people's articles. Everybody's written an article about it. I've drawn, not heavily, but like I referred to Jerry T's list from Star City Games last week quite a few times. I just want to say welcome back, bird friends. We've been waiting for you. All right, so the first thing I think we have to start about when we think about a deck like this is, of course, the lands. Really quickly, one thing I was curious about, Stan, is when you think about building a deck like this, the one thing that I've noticed a lot is that nobody is playing check lands in any of the lists that I've seen right now. They're all saying that they're going to go 4 Steam Vents, 4 Blue-Red Pathway, 4 Spirebluff Canals, and between 7 and 9 basics. We're basically between 18 and 21 lands. What do you think about that mindset?
I think you can play at least 1 Sulphur Falls, if not 2, because when you have 4 Steam Vent and you're going to have like at least 6 to 7 basics, that Sulphur Falls is almost always going to be Volcanic Island.
Yeah, I mean, it worries me a little bit in the sense of having 8 other non-island mountain lands in the pathways and Spirebluff Canals, which is part of the reason that I'm kind of like okay with skipping those, although I could see throwing 1 in just to help you out occasionally.
I mean, you got to keep in mind, this deck is so full of cantrips that if you have enough lands in here and you have a decent opener, you're going to always be drawing into lands. So I think that's kind of your Sulphur Falls insurance as well. Like,
that's interesting.
You're going to be flush with lands. You're going to occasionally be discarding them to Faithless.
Yeah. Do you favor a more or less land approach on a deck that has a lot of cantrips? Like, do you like the 21 or you like 18?
I actually have grown. I'm at a point in my life now, I'm a little older, that
add lands.
I'm always adding 1 land to almost any deck I get from the internet. Like almost always.
So greedy.
Every 21 land deck that I play is 22. My Elves deck has 1 or 2 more lands than most of the decks I see online.
So many red decks shave on lands way too aggressively when you're trying to cast like 4 drops. Like you need to untap. Like you need to cast your 3 drop on 3, and they're playing like 20 lands, and it's like, nope.
And part of that for me is that if you want to shave lands, do it post board. That's where I'm at. Like, I'm just going to put in an extra land main, always have my lands when I need them. And then if I feel like I'm on the draw, or if I feel like I need to play low to the ground for whatever reason, like maybe I'll cut a land.
Yeah.
I do agree with some folks in chat though, which is like Turbo Xerox style decks typically can shave on lands because you do want to keep hitting gas, and you're going to see like hopefully half your deck. But yeah, I do agree that frequently people do try to skimp more often than they should.
But also, these cantrips dig deep, right? Like, Faithless digs a couple. Like, if we were playing all things that only gave you a look at, like, the top card, you're like, do you want this or not? Like, if we were playing 10 ops in this deck, it would be like, okay, maybe I will shave lands a little bit to try to make sure I get into gas. But if you get to look at multiple cards, you can often send the lands away. So it makes me feel like I favor the slightly heavier lands to start out with on these decks as well. Great. All right, starting from the ground up, the lands are the scaffolding. I'm glad we talked about it a little bit. It is sad for me to see the check lands kind of like move their way out a little bit, because I felt like they were pretty powerful at certain points in time, but they are just, to me, they're just really rough when you have pathways, which I think are better. So,
yep, I think people are just slowly realizing pathways rule.
Yeah.
Like, pathways are super good.
Yep. Okay, next core. So if you look at the way that the Phoenix deck, next area of questions I have, the core of the Phoenix deck, right, is basically how are we going to draw cards and get Phoenixes into the graveyard, and then what are our threats, right? The true core within that core of every build that I've seen right now, and I don't think there's a lot of debate around this, is 4 Faithless, 4 Brainstorm, 4 Opt, 4 Phoenix. Okay?
100% agree with you. I was thinking about the core of this deck before I even saw these notes you wrote, and in my mind, it's like we just copied and pasted one another. Like, this is, I think, at least at first, going to be what every Faithless looting or every Phoenix deck looks like at its core.
I'm truly dreading the number of decision points that I'm going to have to see brand new like Phoenix players and brand new brainstormers, including myself, and people playing like there's just faithless looting. What do I discard? Brainstorm. What do I put back on top?
And in what order?
Yeah, it's just like there's just going to be a lot of stuff. I mean, I think there will be some auto decisions, but not a lot. And that's what people like about this deck, and I appreciate that. But woof.
Here's all I'm going to say about that. I've given that some thought as well. And I think the arena interface is going to make those decision points not take as long as I think some people fear.
Yeah.
Yeah, I prefer that you were right rather than me in this case, my friend.
So let's say theoretically that we chose to make a 20 land build of Phoenix from our discussion earlier. And we're going to play these 16 cards that I just outlined for sure. Not really worth discussing them because we know how good they are. We know how good Faithless is, Brainstorm, all that. Opt. Opt is the one that I'm a little bit kind of like, well, you just have to play Opt.
Yeah, and that's the one that like I feel like could one day get cut too.
You would need something more powerful at 1 mana because that's the real reason that Opt is there, right?
Right.
But at any rate, what that leaves left is 24 slots for us to look at in the main deck. And I think that's where the interesting stuff is kind of going on. Mm-hmm. So the first thing I wanted to talk about as far as this goes is the secondary spell suite within these Phoenix decks classically, and even in Pioneer and things like that. There's kind of 2 different card styles that go in this secondary spell suite. And usually it's around like 15 additional cards. Like, so it's kind of 2/3 of the 24 cards I talked about are spells, and 1/3 is kind of like additional threats that supplement Phoenix. So set that aside. The 2 kinds of spells that you generally have in this deck, interaction and additional draw and filtering, right? And so I thought it would be interesting to start talking with the interaction spells really quickly. Basically, from what I've seen, they come down to 3 different cards. You got your Lightning Axe, you've got Shock, and you've got Pillar of Flame. There's usually 4 to 6 of these cards total. But I think there's some questions here about like how you split that up, why you split that up, and what you would do with these cards.
Yes. So Lightning Axe only hits creatures. So it's a little narrow, and there's certain situations where it might even be dead, but it's a way to discard your Phoenixes. So the upside is quite high. And it's a 1 mana spell too. So you can even discard a bird and get it back on the same turn as early as turn 3.
Right. Super powerful card against any creature deck because it advances your plan and it takes out a good sized threat from them for super cheap.
Yeah, I mean, you look at sort of the Pioneer pedigree where if you haven't been paying attention, Phoenix is very back in that format. And they do run a good amount of Lightning Axe. And I think that I don't think there's a drastic difference between the 2 formats and how like you said last week, Stan, and how they play to the board. So Lightning Axe, still a very good card.
Agreed. So now we have Shock.
But how many do we run is my question when we look at it. I think it's 2 personally, or 3.
Man,
but I tend to lean back to 2.
And I can easily see 3, like against Angels, against Gruul, against Auras. Like they suit up an Aura, like 2 or 3 Auras, and they're like, oh, my things have got 5 toughness now. I'm in the clear here. Lightning Axe.
Mm-hmm. So I'm leaning with Shane currently because Historic is such a creature-based format. And I feel like there's really only 1-ish deck where it's actually dead, which is Control, but even Control will sometimes make a Shark token. So that's why 3 might be justifiable, or at least having that 3rd one in the side.
I mean, this is a looting deck.
Yeah,
pitch it, or it doesn't matter.
And here,
like this, like, you know, there's a. Oh man, that stupid beast. You know, there's just so much stuff that like let's say you there's a lot of times when you can't swing in because like the crackback will kill you in a format like Historic. Like I think you want the interaction.
I think it's also worth pointing out that discarding a card to Lightning Axe is part of the cost. So you can always count on it to get a Phoenix into the graveyard, even if you're trying to use it against something like Auras, where they might use a protection spell on the creature you're targeting.
Stan, are you saying that sometimes discarding cards can be good?
It makes me nervous, but if there's a deck to do it, I guess it's this one. But what if I wanted that card later?
I mean, Dave, you also mentioned Pillar of Flame
versus
right?
Shock.
I mean,
which is the big question, because look, here's the thing that people I realize. Pillar of Flame does do 2 damage to any target. Okay.
Yeah.
But it's a sorcery.
Sounds like shock.
Right. It sounds like shock, but it's a sorcery. This is like something you have to keep in your mind, is that it's a sorcery and shock is not. However, Pillar exiles a card.
Yeah. In that mirror, which I think is probably be like 30% of the metagame for the first 2 weeks, you're going to want some pillars.
Yeah. The big thing about this, though, is that do you run a full play set of pillars or do you mix in shock because of Finale of Promise, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, because you do want to have a mix of instants and sorceries in your deck. And so being able to bring back one or either or both to help trigger some stuff can be super helpful in the kind of turn when you're ready to fire off Finale.
I think the reason you mix them up is because the sorcery speed is a liability more often than we may be giving it credit for. And that's because even though it is good in the mirror, birds have haste. And sometimes if they have a big turn where they get a bunch of birds out of the graveyard, if your defenses are totally down, that Pillar of Flame isn't going to save your life. And I think like sometimes that shock will just buy you a turn that the Pillar of Flame might not be able to.
Good point.
So we're talking about 3 Lava Axe here. And then that also means that how many of these shock effects do you think you can fit into the deck?
I think we got to run the full set because otherwise we would be running for Lightning Bolt. And I think we just kind of have to accept that we're just doing a bad Lightning Bolt impression here, and the deck would be running for Lightning Bolt.
So are you 2/2 Pillar shock? Are you all shock? Like, what do you think you would try?
I like 2/2. I might even go up to 5 and do like 3/2 of some 3 shocks, 2 pillars, or vice versa. Just because you want a lot of 1 mana spells. Like your 1 mana spells are so much more important than your 2 mana spells.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point. So as we transition out of this area, we're kind of, the way that we're sketching this up now means that we're in between, we're in between 7 and 8 interactive spells in this secondary spell suite, which means we have like 43 or 44 cards in the main deck by our count. And so now we're going to talk about 2 mana spells.
That's not bad.
Yeah, that's the problem, right? Is that when you look at the rest of the spells you want to put in this deck, you're dealing with a lot of cards that suddenly cost 2. And so there's like space for, I think, 6, 7-ish cards from this list to be able to help you continue to do 2 things: draw cards and put birds into your graveyard. They all have different pluses and minuses. The cards we're talking about here generally are Strategic Planning, Chart a Course, Thrill of Possibility, and maybe even See the Truth.
I don't think this is a See the Truth deck.
I mean, hey,
would love to be wrong. To quote Shane, would love to be wrong.
The only reason it's on my list, it's in Jerry T's list, first pass at this deck, which I thought was pretty interesting.
But you're only getting the draw 3 if you target it with Finale of Promise.
Totally true.
And I don't think that's enough.
I'm unsure either. So, okay, let's set See the Truth aside then and say we're not going to run that card, okay, because it seems bad. But they all have different pluses and minuses on top of that, right? So Strategic Planning helps you dig deep and put extra cards in the graveyard, but you don't get to choose cards from your hand to put in the graveyard. Thrill of Possibility is a instant, but you have to discard first. And then Chart a Course is sort of the inverse of Thrill.
The nice thing also about Chart a Course is that it has this like occasional fail case where it's weird to even call this a fail case, where it's just a 2 mana divination. And that's
where you're attacking with some other threat and then you just draw. Yeah.
Or attacking with birds, right? Like you've already gotten your birds out. Maybe you just have the 1. Like that happens sometimes. 3 birds on the bottom of your deck. You swing with 1, and then you're just drawing extra cards to find other threats.
Yeah. I mean, the big thing that's interesting here to me too is that, we do have Faithless Looting in this format, but we don't have Izzet Charm. And so the question is like,
yes, we do.
Good.
We have a 3 mana Izzet Charm called Prismari Command.
We're not running any 3 mana spells in this deck, my friend.
But it makes a treasure token.
I don't think we are. It does make a treasure token, but I mean, hey, if you want to throw that on the table for consideration for this, I'm fine with that too. But I have not seen any proposed lists from anybody that have Prismari Command in the deck.
Well, that's because you haven't been looking at my lists, David. Because I've been keeping them in my brain.
Are you seriously thinking about that though? It seems too slow to me, to be honest.
The fact that it's an instant And the fact that it like is occasionally going to destroy a Grafdigger's Cage as well, because the fourth mode is destroy target artifact. I think this is a card worth looking at. Maybe it's a sideboard card, but I don't know. Like, I like it more than See the Truth. If we're just going to stack those two cards against each other.
I think that's fair. Do you like it better than Thrill of Possibility?
Does Thrill even see play in like the Pioneer versions any longer?
It doesn't, but that's because Pioneer has Izzet Charm. And we don't. And so trying to figure out like what that balance between instants and sorceries is at different casting costs, I think is like part of what's going on here. And I think that Thrill is only like a one of. The big question here is like, how many strategic plannings do you run versus how many charter courses do you run when you already have access to Brainstorm and Faithless Looting? Because those cards are much lower power level than we ever saw in Modern.
Yeah, I don't know if we're going to have that answer today. I think that's an answer that you identify playtesting and like figuring out how the deck kind of plays out and how the format even lines up and which ones end up being the most impactful in an average game. But I'm actually just leaning towards strategic planning right now based on my experience with that card in Historic and Pioneer because it lets you look so deep. And more importantly, it just puts two cards in your graveyard.
Yeah. I got to tell you, I'm thinking the same way. I think strategic planning, like if I only had 6 of these slots to fill, I would go 4 strategic planning and 2 charter course. And if I have 7, I would go 4 strategic planning and 3 charter course. I really like strategic planning. I think it's a really good card.
I also think it pairs well with Brainstorm.
Yeah.
Just because you can put you could put some birds if you don't have any other discard outlets, you can put birds from your hand on top of your library and then strategic planning them into the yard.
That's great.
Yeah,
that's super good synergy. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We talked a little bit about the other secondary card that Pioneer has that, of course, Historic does not have is Treasure Cruise, which is like a hugely powerful card that was never in the Modern deck, won't be in the Historic deck, but is in Pioneer somehow. So maybe that's their Brainstorm, but it's part of the reason this working out this spell suite. I think it's kind of hard for Historic. So okay, so Stan and I. Our recommendations are strategic planning and charter course. Forget about the cute stuff.
How many slots do we have left?
So I think we have between, I would say 8-9 slots left from the list that we've been kind of like back of the napkinning right now.
You know what I think? We actually have 6 because 2 of those slots have to be Finale of Promise.
I actually think, so a lot of lists I've seen have been 3. Yeah, and sorry, I did miscount. So I think we still have 8. In our mental model, I counted finale in our stuff. So, but you're right. Ooh. We need 2 finales
minimum.
I've seen a lot of lists with 3 Finale of Promise. I think this card is super important here, right?
So, Finale of Promise is the one that you want to have a sorcery and an instant in your graveyard,
right?
Correct,
right?
Yeah, and you want them to be cheap. So it's kind of like part and parcel of the whole deck.
Yeah, and guess what goes really good with that? Turn 3 Finale of Promise for Brainstorm and Faithless Looting.
Yeah, why not? Sounds okay.
It's 3 spells. You get to put birds in the yard, draw some stuff. You get to like look at the top of your deck, then draw them off of then draw extra things off of Faithless Looting, and then put birds in the yard, and then have them trigger all off of a single cast of Finale of Promise.
Should we talk really quick about how to sequence this on Arena so you get to resolve the Brainstorm first? Because I think you always want to resolve Brainstorm first.
I agree.
But I think this is going to be the type of thing that people are going to get frustrated over. They're just going to like order the cards incorrectly.
Yeah.
Maybe their first time doing this. And I think the thing you have to kind of keep in mind is it's the way the stack works is its first one in is the last one out. So if you're choosing which order to cast cards in, the first one you click is the second one you're actually going to cast.
Right. I mean, it's the same way on Moto, but it's a good point to like keep that in mind.
Yeah.
Okay, so why do you think we always cast Brainstorm first?
Because it's going to allow you to manipulate the top of your deck and potentially let you make better Faithless Looting decisions. Right? I'm sure it probably boils down to some version of you have the most information that way, but I guess you have the most information about what ends up getting into the graveyard that way.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense to me. That was what my instinct was. I was trying to think really quickly if there was a reason to just do your draw 2 first, to just peel 2 off the top. But I think that you really want to have as much of a dig deep as you can first. And so, yeah, I think you brainstorm first.
Sometimes maybe it's better to opt first, because you could, in theory, put a card on the bottom of your library before you Faithless.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think if given the choices, you're never gonna pick opt over brainstorm.
Right,
for
because
your
brainstorm
instant.
lets you see 3. And
Right.
opt only lets you see 1 or 2.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's just kind of what it is. And sorry, I almost skipped over that. It's a super important card, but that does take up at least 2 slots in our deck. I think I would start with 2. A lot of people I've seen have 3.
Yeah.
But
the reason why I think 3 might end up being a liability is because it's just dead against any type of graveyard hate. And if people are running main deck graveyard hate against you, it just does nothing at all.
yeah, I mean, I hated playing this card in quantities of more than 2 in like mono red Phoenix, for example, towards the end of when that card was around. That was always really painful. You really almost never want to draw 2 of these, I don't think, personally. So I'm better with having this be something that lets you really power through if you happen to set it up properly.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that takes us to where we get to talk about the secondary threat suite. And I think we have 7, 8, 9 cards to figure out where to fit into this theoretical deck that we've been doing here.
We have 7 slots to fill in, or we have 7 to choose from?
It's both, actually. So
Okay.
I think we have between 7 and 9 slots to fill in our little deck. Our little fake deck that's between 60 and 64 cards right now. But, the thing that is that the reason that I think that Izzet Phoenix was ever good in Modern was because it had a really excellent complementary threat in Thing in the Ice. And that's why it's also still good in Pioneer, right? Because it had a similar way to get paid off by casting a lot of spells, but it attacked the board in a different way. And it also was resilient to things that Phoenix was not resilient to.
And it was also an upheaval.
Right. I mean, that's what I meant. Like, Phoenix could go fast. Thing in the Ice kind of could go slow. Phoenix doesn't deal with creatures well, but Thing in the Ice does. Phoenix is vulnerable to graveyard hate, but Thing in the Ice is not. And so you kind of get this kind of back and forth thing that lets you have an alternate game plan that fits with your game plan very well. The question is, what fills those slots in Historic right now? In Pioneer also has Thing in the Ice, and so you get a really kind of modern-looking creature suite in Pioneer in those builds. But we have better spells in Historic. Yeah. So what are the things that are going to pay that off?
Are you asking me? Because I have an idea.
I mean, here's a bunch of stuff. Okay.
Yeah.
We don't have Monastery Swiftspear. So if you wanted to go prowessy and have like a low mana prowess kind of attack plan, we have Soulscar Mage, but that's it. Not think that we're going to do that. Monastery Swiftspear was never great in Phoenix, right? Because you never wanted to be super aggressive in the blue-red builds. You wanted to be super aggressive in the mono-red builds, and that was fine.
It was in the very first version of Modern Phoenix when like Ross first started taking down SCG tours with it, but then he eventually moved off of it, and most players did too.
Yep. And then the secondary threat packages that I've seen right now all agree on one card. They all run Sprite Dragon, which is weird because Sprite Dragon is kind of just flying Soulscar Mage or flying Monastery Swiftspear in a lot of ways. So it is trying to play like an aggressive bent with these initial builds I'm seeing from people in Historic. But there's lots of other options as well. People are playing with Brazen Borrower because of the bounce. People are playing with Ox of Agonis in some quantities. There's also a chance that, maybe there's things that are off the radar right now with like Magmatic Channeler, which is a card that has come up occasionally as a thing that goes well with Phoenix, although it's never quite got there. Yeah. But maybe this is the metagame to make it work. So I'm not sure what you're thinking about cards like this when you think about how you want to build your first pass.
So my first pass, I think, is going to have minimum 2, probably 3, possibly 4 Brazen Borrower.
Okay.
Because I think Petty Theft is just so important. Grafdigger's Cage already sees main deck play.
Yeah, Petty Theft is just such a powerful and efficient spell.
Yeah. And I think that's pretty important. I don't recall if you mentioned Crackling Drake, but I think that's a nice one as like a 1 or 2 of, especially out of the sideboard.
Yeah. So I didn't get to Crackling Drake. I think that that's super important too, but that's the big question for me at the end of this is like, you have some quantity of Sprite Dragons, you have some quantity of Brazen Borrowers, and then that leaves a hole for like your real marquee secondary threat. And for me, it comes down to, do you want to run Crackling Drake or do you want to run Stormwing Entity?
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of like your true Thing in the Ice replacement, where the other cards are really more utility kind of stuff.
I'm going to throw one more in the mix.
Okay.
Do you want to run Young Pyromancer as an actual 2-mana Thing in the Ice replacement?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that card always had trouble in Modern, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Young Pyromancer is also available in Pioneer, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And it's play in the red-black deck.
Right. So it's interesting to think about. I mean, I think that the home that has gotten really, really good for Young Pyromancer has been with Village Rites, right? And so you don't really have access to that in Blue-Red. And also, people played around with Pyromancer in Modern as well, and it just kind of never seemed to be powerful enough. But that might have been more metagame than anything else. So maybe you could go wide here instead.
Yeah. Maybe. I think that you make a good point that Village Rites is important there, as well as Thoughtseize to like take out removal spells because Sprite or Pyromancer dies so easily.
Yeah, but as far as like the threats that we like so far, do you like Sprite Dragon in this deck? Or are you going to try to like avoid playing that?
I think I love the card. Right. I just think it's a little awkward. Like I don't know when I'm supposed to play it. Like, do you play it on turn 2 and then just swing with a 1/1 and then hope it grows and like swings alongside some birds on turn 3 or 4? Are you holding it to be the actual last spell that you cast, and then it's just like rarely, if ever, going to be bigger than a 1/1 unless you flashback your Faithless Looting? Don't forget, Faithless Looting has flashback.
Right.
So I think it's actually a little awkward, and it has probably the least utility. I mean, it just dies to Fatal Push. The thing about Stormwing is that it dodges so much removal.
Yeah, that's the reason that I still am very interested in Stormwing in this deck. There's a couple of reasons. And over Crackling Drake in my mind, but maybe there's some thought to having it over Sprite Dragon, which is so fragile. And I don't know if we're going to be able to go fast enough to make Sprite Dragon like awesome all the time in this deck as your secondary threat.
No chance it's Riddle Form, right?
Riddle Form? I mean, maybe that is something that you kind of are interested in quite often.
Yeah, it is.
But before we get off of Stormwing, so I think everybody knows how much I love this card. It's my screen name in our Slack. It's tough because you can't play Sprite Dragon on turn 2 in Historic ever, of course, but it has tons of other benefits, right? So you can get value of paying 2 mana for it, not on turn 2. It's totally fine. You can bring some birds back in different ways and then play Stormwing. It synergizes really well with Phoenixes because of Brainstorm and Faithless Looting. You know, I think that it's interesting that those spells go so well with the Scry 2 trigger that Stormwing has when it comes into play, so that you can stack your deck, you can put things away that you don't ever want to draw, or you can fix the top of your deck after a Brainstorm really well with this. You're like, great, put these cards back, now send them away.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
I think that's kind of going to be the difference maker.
Yeah. And then finally, like you started to talk about, Stan, it's resilient to a lot of really popular removal. It doesn't die to Blood Chief's Thirst until you get to 4 mana. It doesn't ever die to Fatal Push, and it can't be Skyclave Apparition. And so that's part of the reason that when I look at like the threats that I really want to play with, I really feel like Stormwing's probably one of the best ones that's available.
Yeah, I think that it's tempting to overlook how good it is to avoid the Skyclave Apparition issue, which is like, let's say you gird yourself up to cast that 4 mana Crackling Drake, and even though it does cycle when you cast it, like for your opponent to sort of just Coco into like a Skyclave Apparition, tag your 4 mana threat, and you're just fishing for another important threat to get down, like you really can fight through the end game with a Storming Entity I think, a lot more strongly than you can even with the Crackling Drake, simply because of the warping characteristics of Skyclave.
Yeah, I'm all for it. Okay, so this is fun. I have another deck I want to talk about that I think we're all kind of excited about, and we have a little bit of time left to do it. So do we have any like net impressions about this deck at the end of the day? Like, I worry if it's going to be able to keep up without Treasure Cruise, for example. But Treasure Cruise is broken. So, I mean, we'll see about the rest of the format. Like, it doesn't have anything that's quite that powerful, although Faithless Looting is super good. So,
yeah, and Brainstorm.
yeah, Brainstorm, I think I am in the camp where like Brainstorm is very, very good. We have a lot of tools in this build that we just sketched out that helps make Brainstorm even better than just like in Pauper, where Brainstorm is like not that good. It's fine, but we have a lot of ways to fix like bad brainstorms or fix our hands. I don't know. I don't know if, like, I worry about a deck like Angels versus this and things like that, where it's just kind of like a lot of flying blockers that my plan just gets shut down by.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. It's sometimes a lot of work to make some hasty 3/2s, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that's the kind of thing that it kind of gets to me sometimes when it comes to the Izzet Phoenix type truthers, which is just like, man, you all really like getting these Phoenixes back out of the graveyard, and your opponents are casting 3-mana 5/5s.
Right.
Like they're putting legitimate clocks on you without digging through 2/3 of their deck, because the top 10 cards of their deck are all gas.
Yeah. I mean, the thing we're really going to find out here is like, can this deck exist without Thing in the Ice? I think is where it's at, because if we had Thing in the Ice, it would be a whole other thing, right? You just upheaval all their permanents. Right. So,
I mean, I'm at the point where I don't need this to be the best deck. I just want this to be a fine deck. I don't want this to be so busted that like we lose Faithless all over again, because that's a card that this might be the only place we get to do Faithless Looting and Izzet Phoenix in a meaningful way. And I think even if this isn't like the tier 0, I think that's going to be fun enough for a lot of people, including myself.
Yeah, totally.
But it's such an explosive strategy. Like, yeah, we can talk about maybe Angels being a problematic matchup, but like then you play control post board, which is something that Izzet Phoenix is very capable of doing, is like kind of shifting into a control deck. And then there's going to be like all the free games that you're just going to demolish Elves, I think, which is like Elves hates Shock. And if we're talking about maybe playing like up to 6 copies of Shock, like that's going to be a fun matchup for the Phoenix player.
Yeah. Okay, so we were going to talk about another deck that we're very excited to play, which is Boros Prowess / Magecraft / Wizards in all formats. I think we're going to reassess and talk about that maybe next week in some form, because I think that this is the other deck that coming out of Strixhaven is going to be a thing, and I think it's going to be a thing in Historic and Modern and Pioneer. Sound good, guys?
It sounds great.
So I think instead what we're going to do is we're going to go to a wind down for the first time in forever and answer some questions from our friends on the internet.
We don't need to take a break. We can just dive right in, right?
Sure.
Yeah, we can wind right in.
We're
already in the wind down.
All right, this is so exciting. I was worried we wouldn't get to do this, but we have like about 10 minutes left, so maybe we can get through a few. First question in the thread is a great one. It's one that I've been thinking about recently. I'll tell you why, but Jacob the Ankles Torn asks, when you have a friend interested in getting into the game of Magic, what's the best way to avoid the feel bad for them in the early stages, especially since they're probably practicing against someone who knows what the crap they're doing? And just as a little bit of background, one of my best friends, with whom I play a lot of Settlers of Catan and Contra 3, never been much of a Magic player, said to me that he's interested in learning. And I was like, okay, well, I'll teach you with some starter decks. I've got Game Night, but I've never taught Magic to anyone. So I'd love to hear if you guys have done that, and any like best practices you may have picked up in the process. Because I always just assume like pick 2 starter decks that are really easy, rather than like giving him one of my modern decks and like teaching him how to navigate that whole morass.
Yeah, I think there's a couple different ways you can go with this. It's interesting because, Shane and I had a similar thing happen a while back around cons, where he one day was just like, Dave, I want to get into Magic. And I was like, okay.
Yeah, I want, and like that's just a dangerous statement. Just like, I want to understand Magic and play lots of Magic. That's what it means for me.
Yeah, and it means different things for different people. Like I knew Shane is like a very completist kind of person. When he gets into something, he's going to get into it, and it happened. Now we have a podcast, and I will say a couple of things really quick. So one thing I think that people do sometimes that maybe is not the best way to actually intro a person is they go grab a box of boosters if it's an enfranchised player, and they go, let's play some sealed.
Right.
Sealed is super overwhelming for people who haven't played that much. So I've actually switched over to feeling like products like Game Night and stuff like that, precons, are way better, I think. And specifically, I actually do really like the Game Night product because the decks are actually pretty powerful and they have 4 of cards.
That's what I was gonna ask you, Dave, is like, I think a lot of the intro products don't even have 4 ofs. I think it's like, make a consistent deck that has like a few variables where it's like, it's easier for someone to understand the plan, I think, a little bit more when it's a deck that is constructed instead of something that's full of a bunch of one-off cards. And so whether you come to that through whatever venue you come through to that, Game Night's just one product that I think does that. But I've had a lot of fun with people doing that. And then you just kind of get to switch cards and stuff like that. They're also single color decks, which I think helps people a little bit for the first like couple of times. And the other thing is, like, honestly, I introduce them to Arena now and say, try out the color challenge, try out some easy events like that, and kind of go from there. Theoretically, Jumpstart is a product that is supposed to do a lot of this work too, which it could. Jumpstart's one of those things that I think is in the middle between like enfranchised player and the randomness that would appeal to someone who is new at the game at the same time. Because I think you'll get a lot of things that are like frustratingly mismatched in Jumpstart sometimes, where I think that the thing that's nice about a monocolor Game Night style deck is they know what they're going to be doing with it after a couple of playthroughs. So that's how I do it as far as product goes. And then the other thing is, like, I play open handed with people a bunch of times, of course, the first couple of times that you do it, and try to just like explain to them why you're doing things, explain to them that you can do instants on their turn and stuff like that. Like, that's one of the biggest hurdles for people, is realizing all the possibilities that open up between instants and sorceries. And that's how I approach it. The stack is hard too. The stack is just hard sometimes.
All right, I'm going to try it, let you know how it goes.
Awesome.
Yeah, I mean, just like build consistent decks with 4 creatures, maybe like some instants, some sorceries, and sort of like, I think helping timing is, I think, the first mental hurdle of this game. Like, when you can do certain things. And so, like, probably don't play cards with activated abilities on them. Play like vanilla or like French vanilla style creatures. Like, maybe like have something with haste, so like people can understand what haste is. I think it's just lots of like, and understanding, if you're a good friend, like, I think it takes a long time to know this about a person, is how they learn. Like, do they learn from failure and wanting to overcome that failure? Do they learn by feeling like they're getting it and like succeeding? Do they learn by repetition? Or like Dave said, like, would they rather play open and be like, ask lots of questions? And that's like, I think, just challenging to know about somebody. And so it's just sort of feeling it out, I think, seeing what's working. Teaching is hard.
Yeah.
The question I wanted to get to is Lou, Wasteland Apologist, who asks what we've been doing to combat the MTG fatigue that many people have been feeling throughout the pandemic, because the gathering is not there. I would say start a podcast. or like more legitimately, I think, like, the gathering is a huge part of the game, and I think I do miss it quite a bit, for sure. But I think we talked about this with like Cave Dan, I think, even a long time ago, and on the Slack and things like that, is part of your community is likely related to Magic the Gathering, whether that's virtually via like a Slack or a Discord or a Reddit or a forum or something like that, right? And for me personally, I would just say that, like, talking to our Slack friends, citizens of the nation, and keeping going with this, you can't really have fatigue and do it and like keep doing the podcast. It's like you sort of like just push through it and don't think about it. And honestly, I do think that the pace of change that Magic has had does keep it interesting. I think for some people it does.
It's exhausting for some people.
I think for some people it does exhaust them. I think for me it does keep it exciting, but I'm also like not trying to keep up with the paper format right now.
Exactly. I mean, I 100% agree. The thing is, I'm mostly a digital player, realistically, just because of my life. It's hard for me to go to F&M and stuff like that. So having the podcast and the Slack community has been like a great extension of that. So the most way that I've kept up with fatigue, honestly, has been to pick up another format, which is getting excited about playing Historic has been a big change for me over the last, 6 months or so.
Yeah, I mean, the gamification of the game, like the carrots are different, the interaction's different, the pace is different. Just something new to pay attention to. I was actually thinking about that this morning, about like, man, if we had not gotten into Historic and decided to take the plunge, like, I just feel like we'd be feeling more burnout. Like, man, what are we going to talk about Modern this week? Like,
I think it's true. I think that there's a certain segment of our listeners that would be happier with us if we had just stuck to Modern. But the truth is, like, we kind of had to do it for us.
Yeah,
because for sure, it's a lot to make content every week, and so being able to have something new to talk about, I think, was helpful in the long run and re-engaging.
Yeah, I mean, I find myself more fatigued by lame duck formats when it's like, we know every Strixhaven card and we can't play it yet, and there's like 2 weeks of that, and I find that's when I'm actually least engaged because I have all this hype, and it feels like the current cards and decks like feel like old hat. Though if Strixhaven wasn't coming out, I don't think I would actually feel this way. I'd just like be building towards something new. Mm-hmm. But now it feels like you can't really build towards something new because everything's about to change. And this next question that you have lined up, Dave, I think it actually kind of relates to my response. So I'll let you ask it first.
Yeah, I mean, the next question that we had was from Grant, who said, in the mindset of a casual spike, would you rather have a wide array of decks you can play to a decent degree or 1 to 2 decks that you can play very well? I think this is a question we come back to lots of times when we talk with people about the podcast, when people think about who they are as Magic players. What do you guys think about that right now?
All I'll say is, like, that's actually kind of the thing that helps keep me engaged, is having a collection of digital or physical cards that lets me try new things out, like at a pretty ongoing clip. Apropos of the podcast, and I've loved MTG Arena Zone, the website, for finding a bunch of weird new decks that people are successful with, which I think is one of the things that like Untapped data isn't as good at, is finding like up and coming strategies or weird brews. But when you have something like MTGA Zone or Goldfish for that matter, like finding new stuff that I happen to have in my collection, just not put together, I think that's one way to keep me excited too.
It's kind of funny, Stan, because I remember your goal for this year was like to get really good.
And I did.
At certain strategies. I mean, I guess you did make Mythic with Elves, so I mean, mission accomplished.
He's made it many more times than us at this point.
Yeah, unfortunately.
I'll tell you my secret one day.
I mean, I do like. Do you really think you have a secret, like an actual secret?
Yeah, I do.
Man. No, you do not.
You want to know what it is? I'll just tell you now.
Yeah. Just tell me.
It's just playing a bunch of Best of One when I'm in the bathroom.
My FPS not good enough. So it's weird. Like, I think for the podcast, I'd rather know more strategies decently, just because we're so often talking about matchups and we're so often talking about characteristics of certain decks and like, oh, this deck has a good matchup against this, or like, and like, but actually having a good amount of reps and a good amount of knowledge about that is important to just have a well-rounded view of a format, I think.
I think, again, if you are not like a real serious grinder, it's very hard to be someone. So theoretically, I would say if you care about performance and you're going to go to Grand Prix, having one deck you're really good at is great. However, I think for most people, the way that they engage with Magic, even casual Spike players, even FNM and boss type people, have a hard time being the person who really is a deck specialist. And so I think it's probably most realistic to be someone who is good at who is decent at a wide array of decks, because you'll have more fun. And that's kind of like the bottom line for me, as it's turned out. But also, I think that's just most realistic for people's energy level and everything.
I'm so delighted that we were able to answer some questions, and really impressed with how much content we got out in this episode.
And we had more, so we have a head start on next week's decks, baby.
Yeah, this is, I think, a new bar for us. And we're going to have to do 4 topics in every episode forever.
Yep.
Until then, that wraps up this week's show. If you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to our podcast so you get the latest episodes as soon as they come out. And if you use Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and review. If you'd like to submit a question to the podcast, you can tweet us at The Dive Down, all one word, or email thedivedown@gmail.com. You know, we don't talk about this a lot, but even if it doesn't make it onto the show, you can just ask us questions and we'll just tweet you back or email you back. We'll engage. Of course, we chat with people in the Slack, answer questions there. Sometimes, when time allows, we talk about it on air.
I say we should come back to this thread from all of our wonderful patrons who gave us so many good questions. We should come back to it next week. We should make ourselves come back to more of these questions next week.
I refuse. If you'd like to support the show, you can join our Patreon over at patreon.com/thedivedown. Also, shout out to Mana Traders for sponsoring the show. And you can sign up for Mana Traders using promo code TheDiveDown, all one word, to get 15% off your first 3 months of renting Magic Online cards. You know, speaking of the Patreon, we are actually on the path to getting to the deck box tier. So
it's been 18 months in the making.
Listen, if you're out there, you want a Dive Down brand deck box designed by our very own Dave, the Godfather Harburger, that's the way to make it happen.
Yeah, and I got to say, you know, we haven't designed them yet. So if we get closer to that tier, I will start posting up designs for people to vote on, to pick from. And so if you want to come in and get like the play mat and help us get to that goal, so then you'll also get a deck box. Like, we are getting close for the first time in like a year. So let's do it.
Yeah, thank you, Pfizer. Thank you, Johnson & Johnson, for making that happen.
Seems to be. They're correlated somehow.
If you play Magic Arena, you can support the Dive Down without spending any money by using our affiliate link to download the free deck tracking software over at untapped.thedivedown.com. As always, special thanks to the bands Nowhere and Spaceblood for letting us use their music. And until next week, get out there and have a great week!